Are you still with the BBC, Mircha?
Yes, I am.
I have a question for you about this man. He's one of your colleagues. He was caught sending child porn to children. Do you know him? Did you work with this man?
Why are you deflecting?
Did you work
How
with
do
this
you
man?
respond, Andrew?
No, it's very
How
important
do you
because
respond to
I'm actually the journalist.
allegations?
I'm the journalist here because I get more views than the BBC.
Breaking right now, the British Bashing Corporation has been humiliated twice on one day. First, by Gary Lineker over its pro-Hamas propaganda, which I'm going to come to very shortly. But let's kick off with the Tate brothers, two very controversial figures, Tristan and Andrew, who I'm pretty sure whatever you think of their rhetoric, you would agree they have been targeted by the UK state broadcaster for years. And there is a real irony to that, given that the Beeb has been the biggest protector of paedophiles in the history of Britain. From Jimmy Savile to Huw Edwards. A point that Tristan Tate made brilliantly in this takedown with a hapless BBC reporter. Let's watch this together, Father Calvin Robinson, and I'll get your reaction off the back.
Ah! The Russian criminal. Hello, friend.
Russia or China?
Russia or China? Yeah, maybe. I'll go Russia when he comes with me.
How do you respond to allegations that you sexually assaulted your girlfriend in the Beverly Hills hotel? How do you respond to that?
Are you still with the BBC, Mircha?
Yes, I am.
I have a question for you about this man. He's one of your colleagues. He was caught sending child porn to children. Do you know him? Did you work with this man?
Why are you deflecting?
Did you work
How
with
do
this
you
man?
respond, Andrew?
No, it's very
How
important
do you
because
respond to
I'm
your-
actually
the
the journalist.
allegations?
I'm the journalist here because I get more views than the BBC. This
How do you
man was a
respond to
pedophile. He
allegations
worked for the
that
BBC.
you
Was he
sexually
a colleague
assaulted
of
your
yours?
ex-girlfriend?
Was this guy a colleague of yours, Mircha? Because he worked
I'm
for the
asking your
BBC.
brother a question.
He was sending this image to children who are
That's
under
deflecting,
14.
Tristan.
He got 0 jail time.
That's
I think you need to
deflecting.
look at your own organization, my friend.
And Lawrence Fox posted in response to that, well said, Tristan and Andrew, the BBC is a finishing school for paedophiles. The taxpayer is still footing the bill for a man caught with the most depraved images of children possible. Your credibility is gone. Get in the bin. And Father Calvin Robinson, I genuinely think Tristan Tate had such an amazing point in this case. The BBC is obsessed with the Tate brothers to almost a deranged degree. Now, that's not to say that there aren't certain questions maybe about some of the Tate brothers' language or however you want to talk about it. But the BBC is obsessed. They want to destroy these two men. They want to present them as monsters. And look, they're not monsters, okay? They're simply not. Now, it's also not intellectual debate. I'm prepared to have that. I know you have lots of concerns about the Tate brothers, and I understand that, right? I understand that. Megyn Kelly has lots of concerns about the Tate brothers. Ron DeSantis does. But what the BBC are doing here is that appetite for destruction. And there is a huge irony, Father Calvin, when they had in their midst for decades two of the United Kingdom's most famous paedophiles. First, Jimmy Savile, probably the worst of all time. At that point, Father Calvin, there was literally a paedophile ring operating within the BBC. Jill Dando, the former Crime Watch host who was shot to death on her doorstep, was trying to uncover it before she was killed. Have we ever got to the bottom of that? I would argue no. Then they allowed a paedophile to present the news of the late Queen Elizabeth II's death. And they don't turn and look at themselves. They're just obsessed with the Tates.
It's dark. The BBC is an institutionally paedophilic organisation and should be shut down. Forget defund the BBC; they need to be closed down entirely. And the fact that Jimmy Savile was only discovered after his death, when everyone knew, all the people at the BBC knew what he was up to, but it only came out after he died, just shows how despicable they all are and how immoral they all are. And it's the same with Huw Edwards. They were all backing him, and in the end, what happened? He got a slap on the wrist for being a child predator. It's absolutely, it's gross what happens at the BBC. And on the other hand, They believe in this. It's almost like a trial by media. So people they don't like, they want to cancel and silence. The Tate brothers are victims of this from the BBC and other mainstream media outlets. And Tristan's absolutely right to point out that, in fact, and that was interesting as well. They wouldn't let him speak. They ask him all these questions, then he has something to say, and they're talking over him. But he's absolutely right to point out that, yeah, how can you stand there and lecture me on morality when you guys are covering for your BBC paedophile colleagues? I mean, it's a fair point. Why should he speak to them?
So much depravity in regards to paedophilia has taken place at the BBC, Father Calvin. And I know we've discussed this before, but I will just repeat, if this were a private company, it would have been closed down decades ago. And then we're meant to buy into this psyop that we should be proud of the BBC as Brits. It's like, I'm ashamed. I'm completely ashamed of the BBC as an organisation that allowed Jimmy Savile to run rampant alongside a whole other paedophile ring that covered up for his crimes, that celebrated him after his death, and then allowed the whole thing to repeat again with Huw Edwards. And I'm sorry, I know what the BBC does, Calvin. It comes after innocent people on the right, like me. At this point, the Tates are completely innocent. They have been found guilty of no crime. Huw Edwards has. They come after Lawrence Fox. They come after Russell Brand. You know, it's so obvious what their playbook is.
It is, and it's sad that people don't always see through it, because the BBC had a good reputation for so long. We've always talked about it as the soft power of Great Britain, and so there's an elderly generation that still look to the BBC for their source of news. And when they're being fed that this person's a bad person, this person's a bad person, when they are themselves harboring the bad people, it's dangerous to our society. It's very sad. But of course, there's nothing that can be done because nobody wants to challenge the behemoth that is the BBC. And I'll put it to you that it's probably because the establishment has so much control over what goes on at the BBC and is probably complicit in a lot of the activities that goes on at the BBC, which is why it won't be defunded.
No, it won't be defunded because the government needs it. It's the propaganda arm for whatever the government of the day is. And that's why they're so terrified of the men on screen. That's why they're so terrified of Elon Musk. It's why they're so terrified of Andrew Tate. It's why they're so terrified of Lawrence Fox. And it's why they're so terrified of Tucker Carlson. But it wasn't the only BBC humiliation over the past 24 hours, Father Calvin, because Gary Lineker decided to sit down with, wait for it, the BBC for his BBC exit interview. So he was hardly going to be asked any hard questions. Yet he still managed to, I would say, disgrace himself and disgrace the BBC with his complete lack of understanding about impartiality, which is particularly important over the conflict in Israel and Palestine, where I would argue, and I would say anyone sane would agree with me, that the BBC has a very pro-Palestine, anti-Israel editorial position. So before we get into what went down specifically with that documentary, which featured the son of a Hamas leader, here was the embarrassing way where Gary Lineker proved to the world that he doesn't really have any brain power. Watch. But first, don't eat breakfast until you learn about caloric bypass. Your breakfast is setting you up for the entire day to either gain weight or lose it. The term breakfast literally means to break your fast that you started the night before. About 4 hours after you eat dinner, your body switches from the nutrients we get from food to the stored glycogen we have in our body. Once glycogen stores are depleted, which is typically after 8 to 12 hours of fasting, the body shifts to burning fat for energy. Fatty acids are released from fat stores where they are converted into ketone bodies through a process called ketogenesis. So then when you eat breakfast in the morning, the body starts the cycle again. This is where the caloric bypass comes into play. Dr. Gundry, a heart surgeon in California, learned that if you break your nightly fast with something called MCTs, or medium-chain triglycerides, if you're interested in the scientific term, you can actually keep burning fat throughout the day and then use it for energy. But there are specific types of food that contain these MCTs. Using this breakfast breakthrough, he was able to lose 70 pounds just through diet, and he did this in his 60s. So you can find out all about it and his exact method by going to thehealthyfat.com/outspoken. That's thehealthyfat.com/outspoken, or click on the link in the description box below, or if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, you can actually scan the QR code on screen. It is important to remember that everyone's body processes fat differently, and it all depends on your unique metabolic type, which is why in the video he released for my brilliant viewers, he talks all about it. It really is quite fascinating, and it might even change the way you think about your health. So go to thehealthyfat.com/outspoken or click on the link in the description box below. But now, back to the show.
You could be partial.
I know where I stand on this. I'm sorry, it's more important than what the BBC, what's going on there is, the mass murder of thousands of children is probably something that we should have a little opinion on.
But the BBC as a whole needs to be impartial about it.
Why? It needs to be factual.
It needs to be impartial about a conflict, doesn't it? And it's hard.
Does it have to be? It wasn't impartial about Ukraine and Russia.
And you might say that
Why does it have to be impartial about... I understand if it's partial about our government and things in this country and everything like that, but something that's going on that far away, why does it...
Because the Israeli position is that what is happening in Gaza, and by the way, I'm not here as an advocate of the Israeli government, but the Israeli position is that what is happening in Gaza is a response to the slaughter and capture of innocent Israelis on October the 7th. And
which was awful, which was truly awful.
And that full context needs to be there when discussing what's going on.
But that's not the full context, is it? Because the full context starts way before October the 7th, doesn't it?
It sounds like you think the BBC is in a complete mess on impartiality.
No, I don't think the BBC is in a mess. I think the BBC it's very difficult for the BBC. I think the BBC generally does a really good job of it, but it's not always easy. I think facts are the most important thing that they, it's like that old thing, isn't it? If it's raining outside, you don't need someone's opinion to say it's not raining. What you want to see is actually what is the weather outside. So I understand why it's so difficult for the BBC, and it really is. And I feel for the people at the top because, the amount of lobbying that will be going on and from people with, that aren't very impartial must be immense.
I mean, he's the one who isn't very impartial, Father Calvin Robinson. Effectively what he's saying, he wants a BBC for the 40% of leftists in this country.
I actually agree with him. I think he was honest. I think he should be able to say, look, this is where I stand. I'm pro-Hamas and anti-Israel, rather than having to pretend that he's got some kind of impartiality. And he's also right in that the BBC wasn't impartial in terms of Russia and the Ukraine, and that broke its impartiality, which backs him as well as us up, actually, in that the BBC isn't as impartial as it claims to be. So stop pretending, I think. Just let people be honest with their views.
Totally. But then you've got to be a privately funded organisation.
Yes, absolutely.
Which obviously we both agree. We would have no problem. I mean, I actually have no problem with Gary Lineker going on his Hard Left podcast. If people want to listen to that, that's fine. What I found very shocking, though, Father Calvin, is that he had no understanding about why the controversial BBC documentary, which was pulled, was such a shocking, shoddy piece of journalism. Now, to sum it up very briefly for folk who may not have remembered this controversy, the BBC presented the conflict in Gaza from the point of view of a 9-year-old child without revealing that said 9-year-old child was the son of Hamas leaders. I mean, this really is an extraordinary exchange. Watch.
What you know now, which is that the narrator of that documentary
as a child,
is a child whose father is a Hamas official, and that wasn't disclosed to the public, which amounts to a serious flaw in the view of the BBC. Would you still sign that letter?
Yes. 13-year-old child narrating. It's not been written by. It's been written by the people who produced the show.
But the BBC failed to do sufficient due diligence.
I don't believe they. I think they just capitulated to lobbying that they get a lot of lobbying.
And audiences didn't know something quite fundamental about the child, which is that he was the son of a Hamas official. Isn't that a problem?
I don't think so, no.
And so you would put the program back on iPlayer now?
100%. I think you let people make their own minds up. We're adults. We're allowed to see things like that. I mean, it's incredibly moving.
But the argument against it is that if you are addressing an issue like Gaza, doing it through the eyes of a child almost immediately puts you on the side of Palestinians who are suffering.
Right. Well,
he doesn't care because it's propaganda.
That's his point.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he wants, propaganda, doesn't he? Father Calvin.
When he answered a question with, that was funny.
Yeah, I mean, what he is effectively saying is he's pro-propaganda. I found it extraordinary.
It's not just pro-Palestine or pro-Gaza. He seems to be pro-Hamas at this point, actually.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that surely you should, at the very least, if you care about journalism and if you care about honesty, at the very least, you should want a disclosure to be made available to viewers. That's what would be honest. But he didn't. And a huge pushback on this from Stephen Pollard, who wrote on X, I've listened to Amol Rajan's full interview with Gary Lineker, in which he is at it again, this time explaining away October 7th by contextualizing it. It's a shame Rajan didn't ask Lineker about his habit of reposting anti-Semites and their anti-Semitic statements and his penchant for Jew-splaining anti-Semitism and history to the likes of Simon Sharma. But the interview was nonetheless so revealing in that context. It's the only time, as far as I'm aware, that Lineker, who has 8.7 million followers, which is why it matters what he says, has actually said anything remotely condemnatory about what happened on October 7th. But tellingly, he can't bring himself to do just that. He immediately goes for the usual tactic of his allies and jumps on why October the 7th must be placed in its full context. And Andrew Gold added, it's so sad. Gary Lineker is gone, totally devoid of empathy and understanding. Roger Waters' level of anti-Semitism, wild fringe theories about Jewish lobbies in charge of the BBC, despite the fact the objective reports show the BBC has a huge anti-Israel bias. A few years ago, this level of overt racism would be sackable, but we're in choppy waters. And from Graham Linehan, not once did he stand up for women's sport. He's a coward. And I'm glad I had the chance to tell him so. And I thought actually that was such a good point from Graham Linehan too. I mean, this is a guy who picks and chooses, doesn't he, what his social justice issues are, Father Calvin, because he didn't stick up for women once.
Yeah, I just don't think he's that clever. I don't,
no, he's not.
I don't think he's not capable of it. I think Andrew Gold went a bit far there. It's not a racism issue. It's like you can be pro-Israel or anti-Israel. You can be pro-Palestine or Gaza and pro-Palestine or Gaza. Like to undermine it and say it's all racism as well. Like Gary Lineker has clearly drunk the Kool-Aid on the Hamas propaganda, but that doesn't make him a racist. Yeah. It makes him pretty stupid.
Totally. And I also, I am actually with you, by the way, on the fact that we shouldn't just shut down the Israel-Hamas debate by immediately calling anything anti-Semitic, because I remember the days when people like Nigel Farage and I were being criticised by the pro-Jewish lobby for using the word globalism, which is just clearly absolutely ridiculous, and criticising Grant Shapps, who we didn't even know was Jewish. So yes, we do have to be careful, but I think when it comes to Gary Lineker, though, he's so far down that rabbit hole, and the interview sort of brilliantly exposed it. Father Calvin Robinson, thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please click on my face just to the bottom left to subscribe to this brand new independent news source and turn on the notification bell so you'll be alerted to our brand new live shows, uncancelled interviews, and special royal episodes. Outspoken is also now available as a podcast, so you can listen to the show every weekday on the go, wherever you are.